So in this lesson, we'll be looking at some more advanced factoring. Factoring by decomposition. It's also known as factoring by grouping, so I may go back and forth in describing it between grouping and Today we'll be looking at some advanced factoring problems. So factoring by decomposition. It's also known as factoring by grouping, so I may be going back and forth between the two. Now, this right here, it looks like a simple trinomial like we've had before. There's no coefficient on the x squared. However, we also have the variable of y. We have negative 8xy plus 16y squared, so it's not quite the same as what we had before. Now, we are going to start this out the same way as before. We're going to choose two numbers that multiply to this final number here, which is positive 16, and those two numbers must also multiply to negative 8. Now, those two numbers would be negative 4 and negative 4, satisfy those two conditions. Now, here's what we do in a situation like this, and this is like the official way of factoring. We're going to break up the negative 8xy into two terms with the coefficients you chose. So those are the two coefficients that we're going to break up negative 8xy into. So we'll have x squared minus 4xy minus 4xy plus 16y squared. So we haven't actually changed the expression because negative 8xy is the same thing as negative 4xy, negative 4xy. So we haven't changed anything here, but this is going to allow us to factor by grouping now. And what that means is if we group together the first two terms, I'm going to look for a common factor between those two. So between x squared and minus 4xy, we have a common factor of x, and I'm left with x minus 4y. So once you factor the first two terms, we can now look at the final two terms. So we have minus 4xy plus 16y squared. When we are factoring, we want the binomial in the brackets here. We want the first term to always be positive. So between these two, they can both be divided by 4, but I'm going to divide it by negative 4 instead, so that when I factor out the first term, it will become positive. Now, also between these two, we can also factor out a y, and then I'll be left with x minus 4y. Now, you know you've done this correctly if this binomial and this binomial are exactly the same. You know that you've grouped correctly. So now our final step. So x minus 4y is multiplying both this term and this term right here. So x minus 4y is in fact a common factor. So if I highlight both of those, maybe it'll make a little bit more sense to you. So because everything is being multiplied by x minus 4y, that is a common factor. And if I common factor that out, it's first multiplying x, and then it's also multiplying minus 4y. So this is now factored into two binomials, but one final step that we can do, because it's the same binomial multiplying itself, I can fully factor it into x minus 4y squared. So we'll be using that idea of factoring by decomposition or factoring by grouping to help us with problems where we want to factor trinomials in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. So the difference here is that there is a coefficient of a, and previously we were able to common factor out that coefficient and we're left with a simple trinomial. However, that's not always going to be the case. You can see in this problem right here, we have a coefficient of 3, but we cannot common factor that out. We can't common factor that out of 7 or 4. So we're going to have to do something a little bit different. Now, we still want to find out two numbers. Now, they do have to still add up to the b term, that middle term, but our two numbers must now multiply to a times c. So that's the coefficient on x squared multiplied by the constant term at the end. So looking at this problem down here, I cannot common factor it. I'm always going to look for that first. I need two numbers that add to negative 7, but those two numbers, they don't have to multiply to 4. They have to multiply to 3 times 4, which is 12. So two numbers that multiply to positive 12 and add to negative 7, I know that those two numbers must both be negative. That will be negative 3 and negative 4. Now, similar to before, with factoring by grouping, I'm now going to break up this minus 7x into two separate terms using these two coefficients. So 3x squared minus 3x minus 4x plus 4. Okay, so I haven't in fact changed the expression because minus 3x minus 4x is the same thing as minus 7x. And now there is a reason why I put the minus 3x first as opposed to the minus 4x, and it's going to help me out with the next step when I want to factor by grouping the first two terms. So I put the minus 3 there because I know that that will factor nicely with 3x squared. I'll be able to factor out a 3x, and I'm left with x minus 1. For the next set of terms, minus 4x plus 4. So again, we want this binomial to be positive, the first term. So I factor out a negative 4, and I'm left with x minus 1. So again, it doesn't matter what order you put those in, but try to pair up the first coefficient so that it can factor nicely with the first term, and your life will be a lot easier. So what we see here is x minus 1 is a common factor. X minus 1 is multiplying both of those terms. So we can factor this into x minus 1 is my common factor, and then I'm left with 3x minus 4. So we're going to look at a few more examples in class. This is one of the more difficult things we need to review before we get into new material. So just remember, for factoring by decomposition, your two numbers must now multiply to a times c, so whatever that coefficient is times the constant term, and then remember this factoring by grouping method.